Good time zone, everybody. Welcome to Horde of Tales Creator Talk. I am Markus, pronouns are he, him, and I am here today not on Tuesdays with our D&D group, but I have the honor of being here today with Eric, aka EldritchCrow, the author of Aether, a TTRPG that we are currently streaming on Thursdays. Eric was so kind to come to our channel today to have a little chat about Aether, about TTRPG design, and whatever kind of other topics we will come up with today. So get comfortable, grab your drinks, and let's see where this conversation takes us. But before we kick it off properly, Eric, why don't you quickly introduce yourself? Who are you? Where are you from? And what else you would like
Uh,
with us?
yeah, I'm Eric, aka EldritchCrow. I am your local, you know, gender weird menace on the internet, I guess. That's the best way I had to describe me currently. I've done a variety of TTRPG streaming and podcast things over the years, a couple of small streams. I've run my own playtest stream of Aether as well, which was a fun time when I was still in mid development of the game and was like, hey, let's just run a story arc while I'm still writing the rules for this game. It'll be fine. Um, so I did that. I've got a creative writing background and a music background. So I'm sort of right in the middle of all that creative stuff. And you can find me as Eldritch Crow basically anywhere on the internet.
Great. That's that little thing you mentioned there of like running a campaign mid-development of your game. I took a quick note of that. I think we'll circle back to that later on in the conversation. Um, how what's your history, your background, your story in regards to TTRPGs, to tabletop RPGs? What got you what games got you into the hobby, and what would you say are um, TTRPGs that were formative or very important for you?
Well, it's kind of funny. I haven't played too many outside of, your bog standard D&D 5e, and I wound up delving into the indie scene sort of later in the process, but I was a pretty, late comer to TTRPGs in general. I didn't play any of them until I think 23, 24. We're My current running Friday group, we've been playing together almost every Friday for 4.5 years, which is a miracle in itself. And then you find out the second miracle of that group is we're an entirely online group that met via a Facebook looking for group post. Um, and God knows there's so many horror stories about that out there that like the fact we've been playing this long is amazing. So that group has been around for a long time, and we started out playing D&D. We've got maybe 2 rotating campaigns of that going on, and then I run a campaign in Aether in the system I wrote for them as well, which I'm currently running a gothic horror campaign for them, which is a fun time. But sort of rewinding back, so 4.5 years-ish just in general, all D&D at the start because it was what we were all interested in. I got into it because I got on the Critical Role train really early. Uh, a lot of this story revolves around me getting into things very early and then getting out of those things as they got bigger and more prevalent because I was like, "Okay, this is good for me." And so at one point I was started out as a player and then quickly transitioned into GMing. Um, and then after the first campaign I GM'd ended, I was starting a second campaign and I had to do a bunch of homebrew rules and stuff. It started with me having to homebrew rules for skyships because those didn't exist in a way that worked for me yet in D&D. They came out later, and then from there, a bunch of other stuff happened. I got a little upset about Wizards of the Coast's business decisions, and then I realized that, oh, I've got like all of these notes written down from when I started those skyship rules that are effectively transitioning into their own game, right? But I wasn't going to work on it for a while because I had other stuff going on. Then I got upset at WotC and I was like, well, I can't exactly be upset about their business decisions if I don't put my money where my mouth is. So I should actually go through the process of trying to design something so that I can at least get a grasp of it, understand what's going on, and then I can actually like give a valid critique of it. It's one of those things where like I'm not going to throw stones in a glass house when I haven't put in any of the work myself or don't understand the process. And
But
so that's
that
how Ether started.
That's interesting, because what you mentioned is that while you were playing D&D and getting into it, you're telling about that you were fairly early on in the Critical Role hype train. I think there's a lot of people that came into the hobby via that as well.
Mhm.
But then you also mentioned that you started homebrewing more and more stuff in your game. You mentioned that you started homebrewing rules for skyships, and before you know it, you probably had like a document of homebrew rules and
I I had a 30-page expansion all
30-page
around.
expansion.
Yeah, running and owning your own airships and all that stuff. And that's not to mention, just homebrewing items and or magic spells and stuff for D&D too. Like that was its whole other thing at that point.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
yeah, there was a lot going on.
Yeah, because I'm I'm kind of the personally, I do think that if you run the same game long enough, you sooner or later will start homebrewing things because no matter how good and comfortable you are in a game system, there's always something you're going to find about it that has you go, hey, I can do this. I want to tweak this. I want to change this a little, or I have a different idea of this. And before you know it, you end up with a 30-page document of house rules and homebrewed items. And that feels like that is already like the foundation for your beginning of designing your own TTRPG. The beginning of this, as you mentioned, that this glass house that you didn't want to throw in for someone else, but you basically want to first build one yourself. And
Yeah,
that combined
exactly.
with that combined um, with what you mentioned, like you got a little bit disgruntled with WotC business decisions. Is there I think there's a lot of we've also in the past month when we had the news and the discourse about the OGL changes that were a big topic. But there's of course WotC being a large company owning basically some of the largest intellectual properties, the largest tabletop RPG. They're bound to, of course, make big business decisions. Um, and that
Yep.
combined with your drive of homebrewing, that got you tend to starting Ether. What would you say, like when you had your 30-page document of homebrew and was driven by your discontent with WotC, is there any kind of specific moment where you thought to yourself, yo, I'm going to make my own game?
Yeah, it was the realization that as somebody who's openly bi and openly non-binary, I probably will never get a job at Wizards of the Coast. When I had started homebrewing, that was a hope. Everybody when they start making stuff for D&D hopes that they could one day work on it. But then around that same point where I was starting to feel disgruntled, they noise started coming out about how they were treating their more marginalized staff and creators and the creators they were letting go as a result. And so that hit me kind of hard because I was like, "Oh, well, there goes that door." And I was kind of really I don't want to say I had my hopes up, but like I was hoping to eventually build myself in that space in a way. And so I knew it was gonna take a while and I knew it was gonna take a lot of work, but I was willing to sit down and do the work. And then I realized that regardless of how long or how much work I put into it, there was still a very solid chance that I would not get a foot in the door. Right. And that's just, that's normal with companies that are as big as WotC in the space. It's just everybody's gunning for that spot, right? And that's normal, but I knew at that point the deck was too stacked, no pun intended. So that's when I started looking at making my own stuff. And there was other stuff going on too. Like I took a break from playing D&D for 2 years. I just got back into it with that Friday group because we were still chatting. I was still, on good terms with them. And then I wrote Ether and I was like, "Hey, this system comes out of me writing stuff for you guys. Like, that was my home group, and so I wanted them to play it, and I managed to convince them, and we've been playing it ever since, right? So, I started playing D&D again just because they had other campaigns going on, and they missed playing D&D specifically with me, and I was like, "Okay, pandemics happened. Yes, I still wanna hold, WotC and all that accountable, but I also don't wanna miss out on time with my friends." That was sort of the decision for me to get back into it. So, yeah, it was the realization that, like, "Oh, there's probably not a space for me in a, like, Wizards of the Coast controlled environment."
Right.
And that sucks, but it's okay because that's just part of the growing pains of finding your way through any space, any community, really.
Mhm. And you mentioned that you for 2 years you didn't play D&D, but then you later started coming back to it with your group who mentioned to you like, "Hey, they were missing playing D&D with you." It feels to me it feels like there's a bit of a tension then on the one hand, you've grown a bit critical of the game, but on the other hand, it's a game you play with friends together and you have a good time together.
Mhm.
Um, how did how did you how did you engage with that?
Uh, Honestly, reconciling that was really easy for me. I should explain. I have an undergraduate degree in creative writing and I have a master's degree in creative writing. So for the majority of those two degrees, all of the editing, all of the feedback was workshop style. So you would hand your piece to someone else in the class, they would go over it and they would give you feedback on it and so on and so forth. And especially in my undergrad, all of that feedback was public. So we would have, like, during our class times, everybody would come back with their edits and say out loud what the main points of their editing was for, whoever had written the piece. And you had to learn to balance saying, "Hey, this doesn't work," with, "Hey, this is what I like about this." Um, and so I've sort of kept that mindset going forward and brought it into how I deal with just life in general and things in media I enjoy and stuff like that, where it's like, oh, it's fairly easy for me to pick something apart and be like, okay, I really enjoy these elements of it, but I can also see there's problems here. And not everybody can do that. It took me a little while to sort of, help get my group in the groove of that as well, because I had explaining to do and I had to explain, why I had made those choices and everything.
Mhm.
Um, Rebuild the bridge there a little bit, but it was entirely just down to I can criticize the company and I can criticize the game while still valuing the time that my friends wanna carve out to spend with me in a day. I can still do both of those things, they do not need to be mutually exclusive. Um, and that was it really, and then I there's a fun part too where if you go to the back of the Aether PDF, there's actually a section where I have gone in and sort of dedicated a sort of entire section to just thanking different people, different influences and designers and things like that. And the opening paragraph of that section tells my group that this game was written for them specifically. Ether was designed around our home group style of play, which is epic high power stuff, but really focused on getting us all invested in a story.
It's it's kind of both a product of what stories your group like to tell, but also a bit of a love letter to them, a little bit of this is for you.
Yeah, that was my way of saying like, hey, uh, thanks for waiting for 2 years. Basically, was putting that dedication in there. And a bit of a funny and heartwarming story is that, like, when I asked them to play it, there was a bit of tension in the group because originally, apparently, when I stopped playing D&D, they thought it was because I didn't want to play specifically with them. They
Oh,
thought something had gone wrong there, and there was a miscommunication there on my part. So when I gave them the rules for Ether, I was like, "Hey, I understand that, like, that's the angle you guys are coming from and why you're upset. Did any of you look at the back of the PDF and see what I wrote there?" And nobody had, and I was like, "Okay, well, go read that first and then come back to me because I get it. I know, and it's
Right.
not like I have ignored that the entire time, but I want you guys to know that, like, I wrote this specifically for us. And so that's what Ether became, and it was one of those moments where I hadn't intended to sell Ether originally. That was going to
Mhm.
be, like, a house system for our home group. But I had enough friends in the space who were also designers where I was like, "Hey, do you wanna just give this a once over and tell me what you think?" And everybody I said that to said, "Why aren't you selling this?" Um, and then they got mad at me when I was like, "Okay, well, what should I sell it for? Like, 20 bucks?" And they were like, "Double that?" Because by that point, it was like a 200-page thing, right? It was an absolute beast of a project,
Yeah.
and that was before I started selling it, so that was already, like, 2 versions deep or something like
Right.
that. My filing and, like, naming system for Ether is entirely borked on the back end because Ether actually started as a dice pool system, and then I
Right.
ran into a brick wall with, just I wanted the math to be very simple, but the results of the math to be very fun,
Mhm.
and I ran into a brick wall with the dice pool being able to do that because I was like, "Okay, this is taking too much time and there are too many tables." Um, so I just sort of hit a huge, huge design block, I guess, trying to get around that, and so I had had a small idea for, like, a one-page card-based dueling game in the back of my head. I was like, "Alright, I'm gonna take a week. I'm gonna go do this one-page game as just like a break and maybe some like side design stuff and see where it goes." And then that game turned into the core resolution for what Ether is currently because
Oh,
it sideways resolved my design block and got me around the problem I was having with the dice pool. So I was like, well, revision number 1, here we go. And so that was like getting Ether to the current sort of mechanical baseline. And then from there, it's been, versions 1.1, 1.2, et cetera, et cetera. We're up
And
to 1.5 official release right now. I have 1.6 in the works, but that's also going to come with a rebrand as well. So that's
right.
going to be fun.
That that's something we might circle back to later, but I like how we slowly moved from your starts, your roots in TTRPGs, your struggles there as well. And also thank you very much for sharing that story of how you basically got back to your group and how they impacted also the design for this game, which I think I read through the rules, and I think it's also very clear from the way you write the rules that it's it's really it's written as if you're like explaining it to a group of people that you know for a while, and there's a there's not too much. It doesn't feel that stiff, you know. There's while reading, I was like, oh, this is nice. This feels natural, and I think that's finds its roots in that this grew from something that you wrote for a specific group. And from there, from designing, you also mentioned that you already went through various versions. You practically picked up a complete different idea because you ran into a design block, and working with that idea got you to rework the entire conflict resolution mechanic for your first version of Ether, leading us into the cart mechanic you have in there. And I want to slowly move more into the design of Ether itself. Because as you already mentioned, the game itself went through various versions. And the current version we're having uses a card deck as a conflict resolution. You do a few very interesting things with like banking cards, referring to the skill levels, keeping the math simple. But all of that doesn't come from nowhere. I'm completely convinced that all of that is a product of playtesting, finding out that an idea that you thought was good isn't as good in practice as you thought. And how would you describe what the design process of Ether as you went through writing, playtesting, getting back to writing, playtesting again, et cetera, et cetera?
If I had to describe it, I would refer to it as the reason I have gray hair. Uh, because like I've had so many points now where I've done like a major revision and then said, okay, it's done. I'm not changing anything else. And then a week later, I'd have an idea, and I'd be like, "Nope, I'm not changing it. I'm not changing it." 2 weeks later, I'd be like, "God damn it, I'm opening this file and I'm changing it." Um, and that's been a constant thing for me because a lot of my design, once I had sort of the bones down, once I knew what I sort of had in terms of concrete mechanical ideas like the card deck and all that stuff, I started digging into, okay, this game exists for a reason, like you said. What problems is this game solving that I had playing other games? That was sort of the track I took with it because I was coming from a player mindset, but also from at that point, a year or two's worth of jamming under my belt. So I was looking at it and I was saying, okay, what player problems do I want to solve? One of them, I found combat was taking forever in D&D. And not just because it is an in-depth process, but also because I felt like there were a lot of things unnecessarily just bogging down player turns. So I was like, okay, how do I shorten up a player's turn? How do I what quality of life changes could I make for players to make it easier for them to do what they want to do? And one of the big problems, one of the reasons I started writing the system as a full system was seeing my players have an idea for how they want to do something and then going, "Oh, but the rules won't let me." And then just sort of offhand discarding the idea. And I'd always be there as a GM and be like, "No, no, no, let's workshop this. Let's talk about this because if you're spending a resource to do it, why not? Like why not just let the cool thing happen?" I've had a few games where in the early days of the Skyship game that I was running, they had a robe of useful items, and one of the patches you can pull off that turns into a window on a flat surface. Rules state you can only put it on a vertical surface. But one of my players said, "Oh, the engine for the airship that they had snuck into and were trying to crash was, it's a 4 foot by 4 foot window. It was smaller than that square, and it was just, sitting on a little podium with a bunch of wires coming out of it, the way I described it." So they were like, "Oh, could I just turn the surface underneath the podium into the glass window and drop it out of the ship?" And so I was like, "I don't see why not." So they dropped the entire engine out of the ship and let it crash. And that was one of those fun things where the rules would not allow that just based on the wording of the stuff. But
Right.
in the negotiation between me and the player, it wound up being a lot of fun and led to a very, big and epic moment. And then the villain that they were trying to take out actually survived. So there was this really cool moment of they had a severe injury, like I said, they lost an arm and all that stuff. And this villain was like a big bruiser type. So I had said that as they were, getting away on basically this rowboat version of an airship, they saw this silhouetted figure just standing, missing an arm, but had blacked out standing up on top of the wreckage. So they were just unconscious but still standing there. And I was like, okay, that's a pretty epic moment. We're gonna leave it there. And so it was moments like that where we started running into what I would call the invisible walls of the system. And so I started looking at those invisible walls as, okay, how do I avoid those, get around them, knock them down, and play? So the first thing was when I came to the decision to use the card system, I decided, all right, all of the math for this game is going to be derived from one number, and that's your skill level. So basically, you can look at your skill level for any skill anytime you're making a check, and you know everything you need to know about it. You know the range of the skill, you know how much damage you could deal with the skill if that's what you're trying to do. You know how many cards you're going to pull for it, and then you only ever write down other stuff about your skill or other numbers about your skill if you have stuff like items or bonuses or things that would make it different than the skill level. So, I don't wanna mistake the pronunciation on this. La Leon Cosplay
Exactly.
asked
Yeah.
how Aether's combat is different from D&D 5e or Pathfinder 2e, and I would say the first version of Aether came out before Pathfinder 2e was available, but it's actually fairly similar to Pathfinder 2e. I would say if you understand the structure of Pathfinder 2e with its 3 action system, you can very quickly grasp Aether's system because it's the same idea with a few extras tacked on. So the math was the big problem for me to solve. I am famously not a math gay, so I had to fix that for myself more than anything. And then I also wanted to make sure that players had a lot of flexibility. So being able to say, okay, you just have a skill, how you use it is up to you based on the description, changed a lot of how I looked at abilities in the game because it was like, all right, well, now you don't cast a firebolt or a fireball spell, you use a pyromancy skill and you tell me what form it takes. And all of a sudden from there, I was like, all right, if that's the style of gameplay I want for this game, then they're going to need ways to manipulate that form. Like the results of their skill need to be malleable. So I needed ways to give them boosts and I needed ways to have them flex, the number of targets or flex the size and shape of the result of a skill. And so that's where you see things like the currency systems come in. You see the potential system, which is the game's main meta currency, and you see the card bank come in.
Right.
So those two sort of work in tandem, where you have potential, which is spent for basically like anytime you need to flex your skill a little bit and just say, all right, I want to do more than what the description of the skill says right now, you spend potential and you do more stuff.
Right.
It was that simple. It was like if you want to go outside the boundaries a little bit, that's how you do it. And then the card bank was my way of saying, all right, I I have this sort of four suit deck. So what if players had a way to stack the odds? What if they had ways to save resources for later, either success for later successes or to save failures and, swap them in for their opponent's skill checks, et cetera, et cetera. And that opened up this whole avenue of like, all right, this is suddenly giving me some really fun ideas for like support abilities.
Which
And so
also I want to bump in for a moment there into the card bank and the meta currencies that we have going on because earlier you
yeah,
said that one thing you ran into in other games was that the rules felt like they were in the way of the story. Um, love the example from the window of the rope of useful items. I have a similar story with one of my groups, but that's for another time. The idea of rules being in the way of story, I think that's one of the typical things that you hear about um, rules medium to rules heavy games that people encounter. I think this is something even in a game like D&D 5e, which in comparison to other D&D editions is slightly on the lighter side, but still has enough crunch. It can feel like you're being bogged down by minutia, and you have this cool idea, but oh no, Fireball can't do that because it has very specific stats. So I can't do it with this.
fam-
Instead,
famously, it doesn't light things on fire.
exactly. But what you with Ether then do is instead of being the rules being in the way of the storytelling, you look for ways of having the rules facilitate the story that the players want to tell while still having a framework of rules to act in.
Yeah.
And
Um,
especially the way that you put the card bank, for example, where you say like, hey, you can actually like bank cards that you pull for your skill checks and the likes, and quite literally having an ace up your sleeve in this game, you give players a lot of control over the ebb and flow in the story. Was that also one of your goals in designing that?
yes. One, because I'm a lazy game runner and I don't like making decisions. So anytime I can look at my players and be like, you decide how this goes, is a key point for me. Um, and that's just like, that's the way I like running games. I don't like being the person, I'll railroad players a little bit in the sense of like, hey, here are your like next upcoming plot beats. This is if you're looking for the stuff I know you would be interested in that I have written in my notes, this is what you need to do, blah, blah, blah. So I'll give them, usually I do it like tied to locations or whatever. I'll say, you have these places you know of that you can go to, for example. And then things go entirely wrong the minute they decide to do anything. But anytime I can get them to basically negotiate or figure out a problem without me having to go to the rules is a success in my head. Like, I cannot tell you the number of times I have just said, "No, let's just do the thing," when running my Aether game without glancing at the PDF, because I know the PDF, sure, I could go find the minutia rule, but I know the bones of it is, alright, this system wants you to negotiate for your desired outcome. This system basically says, like, "Hey, y figure out what you wanna do, and the mechanics are just here to help you get there. They're not here to tell you no." Except when it's fun. And that was the other side of it, was like, I ran into a lot of moments in D&D where failure wasn't fun,
Right.
and we had to sort of make our own fun out of failure, and we usually did that by pushing for, like, dramatic moments,
Right.
those big twists, those big rug pulls, etc. And so that's where you see stuff like the card bank come in as like "Oh, your ally is about to go down, but you have that ace up your sleeve. Aces are low, and you have an ability that lets you force your enemy to use that ace. So they fail their check, and your ally stays up, and it's that last minute save."
Yes.
Um, there's ideas like that baked into it. There's ideas of, I want players to be able to plan ahead, because it's hard to do that with things like predetermined spells and spell slots. But when you have a skill that has a specific description, and then you have various other rules in place for modifying that skill, it's like, okay, a player can look over the rules and sort of, there's a certain degree of system mastery there where they're like, all right, but what if I do this, this, and this? How does this work out? And that becomes really fun. Like, I've had the players pull off some absolutely ridiculous things. Most recently, they lit an entire bell tower on fire and collapsed it during a boss fight, which was a wonderful time. We had a 3-hour combat session that nobody realized it took 3 hours long because we were all engaged the entire time.
And that's what you're going for in those kind of situations. You want to have time fly by in that sense.
Exactly, and you want players engaged, because another thing I did was, with the potential and with the card bank and also with the action system, there's no dedicated, like, action, bonus action, reaction. It's all the same stuff. So if you have one of your action cards held back, you can use that outside of your turn and initiative as a reaction to something else. For example, in that bell tower fight, we were down to the wire with the enemy. He was cutting counterweights on the bells to bring them up through the floor to damage the players, and he was hanging off one of the bells and was about to use it as his last action before they took him out. And a couple of the players had a bunch of actions held, so one of them stuck him to the bell so he would go up with it, and then he tried to free himself by, cutting off his hand, and another player had an ability that lets him heal a status effect or condition, so he healed the cut off hand and forced him to ride the bell at the last second, and he wound up slamming himself into the ceiling. And
Amazing.
so that's one of those things where, like, yes, initiative is important to know who's up next, but I also wanted to give players enough flexibility where it's like, "Oh, I have a skill that I like to use to protect people, and my friend is about to take a big hit. I want to use that skill now." And this was also, Phoenix Mem asked about influences beyond TTRPGs for Ether. This is a specific one, the action system, where I had just played Bravely Default 2 at the time. And I'm a big JRPG fan. Bravely Default, Bravely Second, and Bravely Default 2 are some of my favorites, because they did something really fun in terms of you could take more actions in a turn than you were technically allowed, but that meant that you had less actions on your next turn. So you had 3 points, basically 3 action points you could use, where you could either hold an action and all of your points that you have remaining would carry over to your next turn. So you could start your next turn with like 5 or 6, or you could use all 5 or 6 in your current term for turn, pardon me, for a big blitz, and then that character doesn't act next turn. And so the action economy for Ether is directly that. I stole that wholesale. I will fully admit it. Uh, Nintendo, don't come after me. But I did that because it's such a fun idea for, oh, these characters and these players can tell this enemy is on their last leg. So that, frontline fighter is going to take 6 actions in a turn and risk having no turn next time around for the chance to end this now. Or somebody's going to hold an action to protect a friend, pull a counter spell, do fun, support things with like inspiration moves and, your classic bardy stuff, or, heal a villain in order to hurt them worse.
Right.
Uh,
Yeah.
which is wild, and that sort of the idea of, I almost want to call it modularity to the system was that, oh, I wanted to make sure people could read the system, know the basics, and then say, all right, if I want to get really in the weeds on this, if I want to get really specific and be like super math heavy, super like, oh, reactionary and interactive, then I can go read these other rules on the card bank and other rules on the potential system, know all those off by heart, and just do the thing.
Right.
Or I can completely ignore those and say, I'm just going to work off my skills and have a fun time. See, like, you could play that's the best part about this game is, like, you could play this entire system, never spending a point of potential, never using the card bank, and just using the skill system. Or
That
you could play the system using the additional character abilities, and getting into the potential currency, and getting into the card bank, and all that stuff too.
is that when you designed it to work like that, is that also a way of allowing um, players with different levels of system mastery at the table to still be getting the same out of the system? Because there are other games that have amounts of complexity where when you have vast differences of system mastery at the table, that you notice that there might be some discontent that some players can play the game better than other players because they just have more experience with the system. They take more time engaging with the system. But if I understand you correctly, the way that you can play Ether, you can get equal amounts out of it, no matter what kind of system mastery you have with it.
Yes, absolutely. That was entirely intentional, and there's a couple of points in the rules where I mention stuff along those lines. There's a section in character creation where I mention, I wish I could remember my wording off the top of my head, but it was variable engagement or something like that is the heading. And it basically is just a small segment where I say, hey, these rules are designed so that if you find something you like about the system, you can hard focus that, the part that you like and still have a fun time at the table with other people who don't focus on that thing. It's very much a play the game the best way for you type of scenario. And part of the reason I did that is because I, before I got diagnosed with ADHD, I knew I was some variation of neurodiverse. I just hadn't, figured out exactly what yet. So while I was designing the game, I was doing all these quality of life things and being like, all right, I want to make this easier for me to run and for people to play. But I also know that there are other neurodiverse folks out there who need the I don't want to say the permission, but who feel more comfortable knowing that the system says, "Hey, you can absolutely ignore X, Y, and Z things and still have a fun time. That's okay. You don't have to know all of this stuff." And in fact, the narrator's toolkit opens up with a section called "The Rules You Can
I,
Forget."
I was about to mention that when I was reading through the rules, and as a forever GM, I always have like this reflex where one of the first things I do in a rule book is I flip to the GM chapter or like the narratives chapter, and I noticed the rules you can forget section, and I was honestly pretty happy about that section. Now I have to say I love rules. I don't mind managing different elements. I think one of the most fun things in a TTRPG is when I get to like need to balance all these moving gears, not just the role play of the people at the table, but also the mechanics underpinning it. That's great. But I think every GM, everyone who has been in the position to run a game knows that sooner or later, you're going to forget a rule. And then afterwards, you're sitting after the session and you go like, "Ah, crap. There was that mechanic that I forgot, and oh, why did I forget about this?" Now, when I flip to this section in the Ether PDF, and the game literally tells me, like, "Hey, it's okay to forget some of these rules." That was very comforting to read. That was really cool.
Yeah, and the whole point behind that section was I know the absolute terror and fear of opening to a GM toolkit and just or even just looking at the table of contents for that toolkit and being like, "Wow, this is a lot. Okay." So opening with that statement of like, "Hey, I know this is a lot. You can chuck all of these other things at the bin until you're ready for them. You know, you can make that choice for yourself." And having that up front was my way of looking at, GMs because the entire PDF up until that point had been focused on the players. So that was my way of looking at the narrator and being like, "Hey, heart to heart, one game runner to another, it's okay. This game cares about you. This game cares about the time you have at this table just as much as it cares about the players. It's okay for you to have fun too and not just sit there stressing about what your players are going to do next." Because guess what I used to do all the time running D&D? Overplan a bunch of stuff thinking it's what my players were going to do, and then I used to call it I used to call it running through the wall. I used to give them a window and a door and they would sprint through the wall. That
The
was that was the way I would GM, and it was fun but also stressful because it was like, all right, there goes the 5 pages of notes that I had prepared, but it happened. And so now
exactly.
it's like I have never written so little notes for a campaign and still had so much fun.
You can basically your notes can be goblin with torch, and that's your prep for the session.
Yep, absolutely. Like that bell tower fight, I hadn't planned on that happening. I had planned on giving the players downtime. The players decided our downtime is going to be checking out the bell tower. Okay then. Um, so that was the whole thing. Like I was lucky enough to have a session, break before that boss fight, but that was one of those things where like I knew a boss fight was going to happen there. I didn't have it like laid out or anything. I didn't have the battle map prepared. I didn't have the specific stat block done. I found a battle map and jotted down a stat block inside of like 10 minutes. Um, you know, 10 minutes of work, and all of a sudden it was like, all right, I just have to go find a neat token for this creature and we're pretty much ready. And that was
Awesome.
that.
Awesome.
Um, and that's the thing is like over the many iterations of Ether, one thing I've dialed in on more and more each revision has been this game gives a shit about the time you have at the table. It cares about you. It cares about you having a good time. It cares about the people around you having a good time. And it cares about not just you as an individual, but the entire group having a good time together. Which is the origin behind mechanics like the Omen system, where it's like,
Right.
hey, write down a couple things that you like as a player outside of your character's brain want to happen in the story that your character may not know about. Because that's a very weird and sometimes difficult thing to ask of a player. But I've seen it turn into a really fun thing now where like they especially my players are a bunch of masochists. They think of some of the like most dramatic stuff that can possibly happen with that. And so those trackers, the omen trackers and then the bonds and values where it's like a hey, I know somebody, can they help us? And you have a little meter that fills up the amount of times the amount of times you manage to do that or the amount of times you manage to stick to a character's values and sort of be in character in that sense. Those are all ways for that variable engagement to come in. It's not just player facing stuff either. It's like, oh, this player sticks to their character's values, so all of a sudden their meter fills and everybody at the table gains XP because one player decided to be really good at playing in character today.
Right.
Or another player was making a lot of checks, pulled a lot of aces, and suddenly their omen tracker fills up. Everybody gains an XP, and something big story wise is about to happen tied to that character
And that
because
also
one player was making a lot of skill checks.
And that also then, since everyone is getting the XP still, even though if it's one character that had this progress of their story, it's still everyone at the table that gets rewarded for that. It's still a group effort, and everyone moves forward as characters move the story forward in that way.
Exactly, and it leads to some fun instances where, like, we've had some weirdly timed level ups, but it's always been fun because then they've had to figure out, okay, how do I know all this new stuff? Like, why is my skill better all of a sudden? And how do I know like this new ability that I have out of nowhere? So it's been a really fun way for them to sort of tinker around that stuff. But those trackers also work for the game runner as well. So I described the Omen tracker as a gate where the game runner knows each player has these specific things that they want to happen, but the game runner also knows, okay, I'm not allowed to use any of those things until a person's meter fills. So there's sort of like a ticking time bomb effect where every ace the players pull just sort of ramps up the tension and the drama a little bit because they know they're getting closer and closer to that big thing. And to them, it gets built up in this big moment. And all of a sudden, the GM can, or the narrator, pardon me, can just sort of drop a small hint about what's going on and then reset their tracker and let them go. And it's like, but I was so worried about this. And I'm like, yeah. And now you're not worried about it anymore until next time.
That is a great way of mechanizing those kinds of story developments and giving them a part in the rules. And again, circling back to earlier, having rules facilitate the story instead of being in the way of it. From what I'm getting, I mean, I've been reading through Ether, and there's a lot of these things that you're describing that all feed into what you're saying here. That this is designed for the group together at the table to feed into these heroic fantasy stories of um, dramatic, high-paced action, but at the same time keeping it simple and having the rules work for you to tell the story you want to tell. And it's great to see how the game developed through all these layers and is now in this state. And as you mentioned, you're still working on like an updated version for it. So there's more that you still want to tweak in it. But I'm curious as we're slowly drawing to the end of this nice little conversation. Um, just imagine there's just humor me for a moment. Imagine that suddenly behind you, there's a time machine appearing, and you can take that time machine back to the moment to a very one of the harder parts of your development of Ether, and you could travel back in time to yourself and give yourself one piece of advice for game design, like one kernel of wisdom. Is there anything that you would tell your past self, and also any other people who might be watching this who would be curious about designing their own TTRPG?
Hmm. I'm gonna get really into like minutiae here and say get rid of anything that does the same thing under two different names. Like any duplicate mechanics, if they do the same thing, if one gives a dice bonus or whatever, and another gives a dice bonus, but the dice bonus effectively does the same thing, get rid of one of them. You only need one. Trim out everything that is duplicated. That's been a big push for me lately in terms of getting the latest version of Ether done. And it's been one of those things where I've slowly done it over other revisions as well, but it wasn't a huge focus until now. And if I had had that mindset going into version 1, I would have saved myself a lot of editing and a lot of work, and also a lot of confusion in playtesting too. Um, so, like for example, in this new rebranded version, I'm getting rid of the potential system entirely. And that is getting looped into the card bank. So the card bank is going to be the only meta resource, but it's going to play the role of the potential system and the card bank as they are now in the rules. And it's because I looked at that and I'm like, okay, but like the card bank is the more fun mechanic of the two, but they are effectively doing the same thing. They both have the same goal and they work together to do it, but there's no reason to have both when I can just use the one.
Right.
So that's been a big sort of selling point for me doing the revision. Also, side note, I had done a failed Kickstarter for it. So that was why I hadn't been planning on doing a new revision because the Kickstarter was going to happen. But since it didn't, succeed, I was like, all right, well, now I have the freedom to go and make this revision and the rebrand happen. So I'm just going to go do it. But yeah, cutting out anything duplicate is big. It saves your page count, it saves having to explain the same thing multiple times. There are certain things you can get away with where it's like, oh, if a certain concept needs to be repeated in the player section versus the GM section, that's cool. That's fine. Leave that in. But if it's just like you have two mechanics that do the same thing, change one or get rid of one because that's just boring design.
That is some really great advice. Like basically change it or remove it if you've already done it in the system. Keeps it lean, keeps it clear. Awesome advice. And I'm really looking forward to that updated version then where we see the potential system rolled into the card bank. Really curious to see how that plays out. Eric, I could talk with you for hours and hours and hours on this, and I'm really glad that we had you here. But we're slowly gonna wrap it up here. It's great to see the enthusiasm you show for this game you've written. I am so glad that you shared with us this story of how the game came to be, how you wrote it for your group, how you iterated it from version to version, and also sharing this nugget of wisdom with us. This was really great to have you here, and I am really happy to have you here on board with us for this
I
conversation.
was absolutely thrilled to be here. I don't know if I mentioned it, but the stream you all are running on Thursdays is the first time it has been streamed or played live without me at the helm. So this has been a big sort of, breakout moment for me because
Right.
now I know that this system is written well enough that other people can learn it and run it. It's not just me having to be there to explain it. And that is a big sort of stepping stone for a lot of games, I think. So
Yeah.
I've been absolutely thrilled with the way that's going. Um, and I I was just absolutely thrilled to be here. I always love talking about it, and I'm glad I get to talk about it with folks who appreciate the system enough to run it.
Yeah, and I already noticed that Ida was so nice to quickly share the link in chat to your itch page as well, where, if I'm not mistaken, you also still run a sale on Ether. So people who are curious
Mhm.
about the system, it's currently 50% off, where you can get this PDF and read the system for yourself.
Yep.
Um,
It's 50% off all the way to May 31st, because the Seekers of the Heart stream is running into May. So I wanted to put it on sale just to sort of honor that and be super excited about that.
very cute.
Um, and on top of that, if you purchase the system, whether it's discounted, whether it's not, you get every future digital version of the system that I put out too, because I just update the files. So you can get it now and you'll get every version that comes out, including the rebrand and all that stuff too. So go check it out.
Also, also, don't forget if you buy Ether on itch.io, if you buy any kind of indie TTRPG, indie game or something, and you really like it, make sure you leave a review also on the pages. That is something that is so important to indie game designers to have these reviews on their sites to show other people, yo, this is a great game. You should check this out. And here are 15 reasons that maybe not 15 reasons, but just share your reviews on the itch pages and help designers like Eric to get this game to a broader audience and hopefully into a bright future.
Fingers crossed. Also, reviews just make us feel good and keep us designing. So do that too,
Exactly.
because your local favorite indie designer needs a serotonin boost now and again.
Absolutely. Well, if you from this conversation got curious how also Ether plays in practice, you're in luck because tomorrow, same time on this channel, we're going to have the next session of Seekers of the Heart, a game run in Aether by Eric here. It's run by our fantastic Angela, who's also been hanging out with us in chat today. And you still can jump on fairly early on the train. It's the third session tomorrow. There are some great characters, great personalities, amazing lore drops, and you get to see Aether in action as well.
And come support it because it has big lovable rock boys and like a mannequin nun, and it's amazing.
If big lovable rock boy and mannequin nun are not enough to sell you on this, I don't know what will.
It's lovable and weird. Go watch.
All right. Eric, it has been an absolute pleasure talking with you. Thank you for coming here. And if you liked what you saw here, you can, of course, subscribe or follow our channel here on Twitch. And if you want to check out any of the VODs that have already available of the first sessions of the Seeker of the Heart game, you can find those on our YouTube channel, which is youtube.com. And don't judge me now, I'm contractually obliged to do this. youtube.com/Horde of Tales, and there you can find the VODs of Seeker of the Hearts and any other game that we play here as well. I am glad I did this at the end of this conversation. Otherwise, I fear that Eric would have just run out on me.
Yeah, you would have just seen my camera turn off. Yeah.
All right. Thanks everyone for dropping by. Eric, thanks again for being here. And I wish everyone a great day and see you soon back on Horde of Tales.
Bye,
Bye
everybody.
bye.